This is the Math Map Book Club, where ordinary parents encourage one another to develop an extraordinary appreciation of math. We love what we know and struggle over the unfamiliar. Through weekly conversation and exploration among friends, we can begin to enjoy ideas that seem difficult. Join our book club as we discover how math helps us to know God and to make Him known. Hi, I'm Leigh Bortons. It is Wednesday, January 17th, 2024. Welcome to the second episode of the Math Map Book Club for this year, where Kirsty Gilpin and I discuss 2 lessons each week from our soon-to-be-released math curriculum, the Math Map, for families with students in classical conversations. Everybody, welcome. Kirsty, it looks like we should get started. We're covering 2 lessons.
We are. And Leigh, I just want to take a moment to let everybody know, because last week we had such a great conversation and so much help from some key people. So I just wanted to let everybody know, Babs Harrell and Jill Philbrick are our mentor tutors. They've been piloting the curriculum for a number of years. And so if you see them chime in, especially in the chat log, they are speaking from personal experience with the curriculum. Shauna is joining us, and she is one of our curriculum assistants, and so also another great source of information. And last week, I know Jana and Donna also were helping to answer some of your questions, and they've been with us here at the book club for quite a while, as well as in the master's course, in the CC Masters math course. So there are so many people who have gained experience with the Math Map and are helping. Wanted to acknowledge them and thank them for being consistent contributors. So I wanted to open this week. We went a little bit long last week, and I felt like there were maybe still some lingering questions. So I just wanted to take a brief minute. If you have questions left over from last week that you would like to address before we jump into week 3, are there any of those?
Something you can do to help the flow too is at the end of this episode, if you think of the question, type it in somewhere so we're ready to go the next week.
Great. All right, well, nobody's chiming in, so we're going to go ahead and jump on to page 1 of week 3. And
just so you know, Jana's asking if we can show the Math Map graphic. So maybe in the next episode, put that in at the front where we ask about questions. So just a reminder real quick.
I can do that. All right, so here we are. Lesson 3 is all about comparison. And here one, so we're going to start as we did last week, and ask everybody to take a minute and share anything that you see that is familiar, something that is unfamiliar but interesting.
I think 10 equals 10 is familiar. The number line is familiar.
The real number line is familiar. The imaginary number line was not so familiar to me.
Yes.
For some people, depending on the age you're working on, line, ray, segment might be some terms they've seen and copied before.
I think what will feel are we only doing familiar first?
Well, you can do both. You can share both.
Because I think what will feel unfamiliar is this idea of what's a vector, and possibly not to the adult in the room, but to the child. I don't know what the symbols at the bottom are.
The way it's set up is becoming familiar. I can tell this is the first page because it has the flashcards checkbox.
Excellent.
Ooh, good observation. Yeah.
Are you starting to notice that the instructions are familiar, that it just says trace, trace, trace? So once you show a non-reader, wherever there's the big T and there's gray, you can just trace.
And that does make it easy to find and get started tracing before you really even process the page.
That sounds like a good way to become familiar with the page.
Great. So as we look at this page, big ideas from this page, we are moving from 0D, which we talked about the last couple of weeks, into 1D. First introduction to a new domain. And you pointed out, we're feeling familiar with that real number. Right? Did we have a line the last 2 weeks? No, right? So that may be familiar from past learning, but if you're a new learner working through the math map, that might feel unfamiliar because it is a new idea this week. We're now looking at the real number line, and that grid, that when we talk about that grid is a way of finding location. And in 1D, we find location on a line. Right? That's our only choice, is where do I live on the line? That line can be, like we look at the middle of the page where it says line, it has ZB. You're going to notice different arrowheads compared to where just above that, there's a line that says real and has 0, 1, 2, and 3 on it. Those arrowheads are a little bit different because we're representing different things. So where those arrowheads are filled in, that's an actual physical line. And we can't really see a physical line because it's one-dimensional, but it can exist, right? We know that it exists. And so it's a concrete thing that exists. When we look above and we see the open arrows, that's telling us that it's an axis, and we're labeling that axis. We're making a one-to-one correspondence between points and numbers. And now I can suddenly find location, right? So on that line ZB in the middle that I was talking about, I could tell you where Z is and I could tell you where B is, but there's not a way to talk about any other specific point on that line without labeling more points. But on an axis, you can pick any number and I would know exactly where you were talking about. And the beauty of that axis, and we sometimes refer to line when we're talking about making that one-to-one correspondence, is that it's ordered. And so that's another big idea for this week. So the big idea is really, as we're looking at this page, are lines, and then the idea that now we have order, right? And so order allows us to compare things. Okay, we're going to move on to page 2. Looking at this page, what feels familiar and what is unfamiliar?
The words inch and yard and mile are familiar. The unfamiliar is, well, I know what it is now, but when I started, I didn't know what the squiggly line was at the top, but I know it's an integral now.
It looks like something you'd find on a violin.
Yeah.
It does.
The fractions to whole numbers are familiar too.
Are you talking about the 5/8 mile to the 1 kilometer or the 10 over 10 to 1?
The 10 over 10 to 1, 20 over 20 to 1.
The tracing is familiar, but the complete is new for this page.
Is it obviously to you what you should complete as an adult?
Yes.
And maybe a child will find that tricky, right? So this might be a
Well,
place they need
and
some help.
I love that it repeats, like it's there without the number line, but then it's there with the number line. So if I'm working this with my, 6 or 7-year-old child, I can say, let's just count 1, 2, 3. So what number do you think goes in the blank?
Mhm.
And then we can look on the bottom and say, look, there's things to count, and introduce it and say, this is a number line, and teach them something. So it's the familiar to the unfamiliar. They're not going to be familiar with the number line, but I am.
When even using the word tick, so those are the things you're counting on that number line if you need a concrete word.
Is there like a word, like a kind of index or dictionary of some of those words that will be available for the teachers if they're not familiar with things like, you know, calling those things ticks instead of just lines, or, you know, so that the correct vocabulary and grammar is being used?
We do have an extensive glossary that will be available to parents. I can't guarantee that every word you look up will be in there, but we have added a lot of words. And I can certainly look at including words like ticks that maybe we take for granted. They are, one of the things that a lot of you haven't seen are the charts. And a lot of that information is also in the charts. So there are different references that parents are going to have available that are going to help them to see this. But that's a good word that we may take for granted and not necessarily think about.
One thing you guys can do is just pray for Kirsty. The glossary that she's building is kind of like I mean, it's pretty amazing how thorough it is. And when we miss a word, she's real quick to go, be good. She wants to add it in. And what she did is she wrote the word tick, T-I-C-K, then she would show the image of the T-I-C-K, and then she gives a math definition so that whatever direction you're coming from, a lot of knowledge or a little bit of knowledge, there's something more for the parent or tutor to learn.
So as we look at this page, two things I'd like to point out to you, especially as we're looking at this naturals and digits, right, that we're looking at here. And then if we're thinking about the complex version, and last week, somebody was looking at the complex and went, wow, these are really aligned. And that's exciting that you guys can see that, because Leigh has worked really hard to make sure that things do align, so that looking at this page here with the naturals, we may look at that with the complex level and see something that is very similar in the what we're studying, what we're practicing. With our younger students, some of these may be reading exercises, or we may see answers, right? So we're looking at things here, and there's not necessarily something for younger students to calculate or solve, but yet they're learning because they're reading, right? Or they're looking and identifying maybe what the answer is that's given to them, but putting all of those pieces together. And then I wanted to point out on this is down at the bottom, somebody said it's familiar to them that 10 over 10 is 1, right? That a number divided by itself is 1 is really a big math idea. That we want to help students to recognize that that's something that we're going to use over and over again. So we came up with the idea that we would put a green box, right, around those fractions. And that just stemmed from probably something a lot of you have done with your students, is when they have a fraction that equals 1, you draw a 1 around it. And so we just decided we would use that green box so that students have that visual cue, oh, this equals 1. And I'm going to give Jill credit, because she was the one that said, we need a name, and came up with the idea of calling those identity fractions. And so that is a math map specific name. When we see a fraction that equals 1, we're calling that the identity fraction, and it has that visual cue.
Kirsty, let me answer a couple of questions. One's about just kind of expectations are reading. So let's just look at this page. You can see where this font is look at the trace, that's 14 point font. If it's that size or smaller, it is meant for the adult. No one's expecting the kids to read that at this age. I mean, there's kind of like clue words here and there to help parents, and that's why we left them in there. And then look at like where it says 1 inch and then 1 centimeter cm. So we put the centimeter in a font where it's more for the parent, but the child just traces the cm. So really anything that's gray or that size font, which is, blacks, like at the top, those are 24 point fonts. Those are all things for your children to know. Then somebody asked another question that relates to that. If you were to look at page 1 and 2 together, which we don't have a slide to show you, somebody asked about would the children be taught what greater than and less than and equal to mean? No, we don't expect 5, 6, 7-year-olds to know what those mean. All we expect for them to do is to trace it, to become familiar with it, not to name it, not to do any calculations, not to identify it. So that's going to be the hard thing for parents is when, parents want to know things. Kids are just going to be like, can I just, color on my pages and trace and fill things in, match some things up. So, but all of those things that you don't see on the page, they are in the companion and in the charts and in the glossary. There's places for it.
So Leigh, I may have missed my answer in your answer.
Okay.
So I just want to restate. So as a parent, when I get to these instructions at the bottom that say read the words aloud, is that that's an instruction for me to read words aloud with my child, and it should be all the measurement words?
So Kirsty, did you get to talk about that last week?
No, we didn't really talk about that last week. No.
Okay. So I'll answer real quickly. At the bottom of page 1, it says to read some things. Page 2, read things, and page 4, I believe it is discuss. And what we're trying to do is point out that if you're trying to use this to teach your child to read, don't read everything on the page. We wanted to see that you could parse it out. So on maybe one of the pages of the day, have your child practice reading the words aloud if they're even reading at all. Another day, you might want to have them to describe the images to you that they see in front of them. And another day, you might say to them, hey, let's just look at the symbols. So it's a way to help you kind of parse out. Don't do it all at once, but here's some things you can do to help them learn the language when they're not really reading yet. Does that help? Do you understand? They're just reminders is all they are.
Leigh, one of the things we did talk about last week, and it's maybe a good reminder, is I mentioned it last week and I'm going to mention it again. Right? Leigh likes to tell us to make sure that you use the book or the resource and don't let the book use you. And so when we look at the math map, it's really tempting to say, I need to start at the top of page 1 and work all the way through page 16. And I need to look at all these other resources and I have to do it all. But we have created this resource because we want parents especially to feel equipped to lead mathematics. And so there are so many curricula out there that are encouraging parents to believe that they can't teach math at home and that they need to outsource mathematics education. And it's in their marketing and it's in how they sell their programs, right? Let us take this burden on. But what they're really saying is parents can't. And math map at its heart, one of its hearts, right? We have all these goals, but one of the key goals of the math map was for parents to feel equipped to lead mathematics education in their home. And we have put together a resource that parents can use in their home to meet the needs of their students. So for some students, it might be they just need to sit and go through and trace all of the things. Other students really need to have a parent sitting down and the words with them, right? And it's going to be, there's enough here that every family is going to be able to find the rhythm that fits them. And I'm really excited about that. And so it's tempting to look at this and go, I have to do everything. But you don't, because you're going to see these ideas year after year. And we're trying to give you here lots of hints as to how to use this in your home. And I just think Leigh's done a great job of putting together that can be used in a lot of different ways in your homeschool. All right, moving on to page 3. I'm going to point out here, just because we are a little bit behind on our time. So I'm going to point out here that the title of this page says Processes with Science Notations. And although you don't see an example of it on this page, this is also the section of the curriculum where we talk about scientific notation. And we've had a couple of people question that. And what we really want you to know is that the math map is really designed to support scientific inquiry. And so there's a lot of emphasis on conversion factors, on learning those international standards for measurement, for being able to use scientific notation and significant digits. So all of those things that are going to help our students to become good scientists, we're supporting here in the math map by practicing with those ideas. And let's look at page 4, and I'll go ahead and give you a minute to take a look at that and what is familiar or unfamiliar from this.
The limits are unfamiliar to me.
I struggle with them too, Charisse.
The blocks are familiar, the hundreds blocks and the set. Those are, I've used those before, so that's familiar. And the image up at the top, what stack is the limit and height, which is an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that, but I like the image. So
I see that word vector again, and now there's a picture to help me assimilate it to the other things that are familiar to me.
In all the new things, we're just using like 1, 2, and 3. We're not just that repetition on all the pages.
Yeah, so just, in naturals, we do take your students up to 100 in digits. The year before, they would not, they think they do 100 one time just to read, just to name 100 block. But otherwise, it's always 0 to 9. So, and then this course is page 1, 2, 3, and 4 when they're just getting started. So we make the numbers a little bit harder each day, but they're never really big at this age.
But I love that you're all being classical, right? Because one of the big ideas behind classical learning is I get my grammar, right? I'm learning vocabulary, but it's disjointed. And then as I compare and I attend to things, and through that attending, I start to compare things, I start to define things and name, right? I'm using those core habits and those common topics. As I'm doing that, I'm starting to build those connections and make understanding. And so here you very naturally said, oh, wait, I've heard that word vector, wasn't sure in my head. Now I'm seeing it in a way that I can make that comparison. Now I have more understanding of what a vector is, right? And so that's the whole idea behind the classical approach to mathematics that we're doing, is building, right? What we're teaching our students is how to build those 15 skills of learning through mathematics. And that's exactly what you're doing. So we're confident that not only are they going to build those 15 skills well, but they're also going to develop a better understanding of mathematics because they're using those 15 skills.
If you look at the hops and vectors in the top, do you see how it's 3 parentheses 1 and 3, these weird arrows 1? So that's another one of the skills of the mathematicians use is when they're trying to learn something new, just like when we're trying to learn a new ending in Latin, we compare one that's familiar to one that's unfamiliar and start to build our vocabulary that way too. So you guys see hops and then you see the vector another way underneath. We're getting somewhere. Not real fast, but we're getting somewhere.
I think this shifts all of our math paradigms, because when I was learning math, the goal was to get to the thing you didn't know, get to the new thing. And so making it so comfortable by starting with what you do know is a complete shift for math education for me.
Thanks, Karen.
Especially for weeks, well, throughout the curriculum, there's going to be a lot of repetition throughout the year, but I did want to point out here that last week, one of the pages that we looked at was looking at place value. And you'll notice here, we're looking at place value again. And so this idea of repeating these ideas each week is really going to help our students to become familiar over time. All right, so let's pause and make sure that everybody's questions are being answered. Does anybody have a question that hasn't been answered that would like to speak up?
I have a question about the frame pages. I think the lesson pages itself is more intuitive than the frame pages at the front. So for a parent who, me myself included, looking at the frames at the very first time, it's the sheer amount of information on it. It's quite overwhelming. What would you say to a parent?
Sure. So if you have seen the full curriculum, then that's where those frame pages are, just like the charts. If all you've seen are the naturals pages, you haven't seen those yet. But as I talked about earlier, having so many different parts to the curriculum that you can use at home or in community to meet the needs of your students, the 16 lesson pages are just one part of the curriculum. And Leigh would probably tell you that they're not always the most important part of the curriculum, that they're there to provide opportunity to practice the grammar. But she has intentionally designed the curriculum so that those lesson pages are framed by pages that give you more. The cover, for example, gives us this beautiful introduction or invitation into the math conversation. When you open up your curriculum, you're going to see that contribution to the conversation that gives you one idea of how somebody else maybe saw a connection between those cover elements and the topic. You're going to see the math every single week, so you know where you are on your math journey. And then turning that page, there are two pages that we call invention, and then the other one is memoria and arrangement. And so especially if you have been working on your classical skills of learning, you'll recognize those as our canons of rhetoric. And that goal of those pages is to take pieces of the grammar that are related but aren't necessarily all in the same week and examine them across the dimensions. So the charts, again, part of the full curriculum, not part of the naturals beta, the charts are the same every year, and they give you sort of the full map for that particular topic. So for lesson 3, that would be comparison. What are all of the different things that may be related to comparison all on one page? The frames, these two frame pages, invention and then memoria and arrangement, try to pull together images that relate to one or two of those ideas from the week, and then some symbols, and put those into context so that we have this opportunity, especially in community, to have a conversation that pulls together ideas across the dimensions. And so at home, you may use those by just asking your students, tell me what you know about this. That's one of the best things that we can do, right? Is tell me everything you know about this. Look at this image. What does this mean to you? We are equipping tutors to ask some specific questions from that invention page to model those 5 common topics. So the tutors will be equipped to lead their class that way. And then that memoria and arrangement page is really designed to help take some of that grammar that students are memorizing, but to help them see how it goes into context, right? How arrangement can help us to learn. And so again, at every home is going to be a little bit different. Students are going to encounter those in the challenge classroom, and at home, it's one more place where you can have a conversation. The rest of the frames are at the back of the booklet and are going to include a page that we call the careful calculations, which Leigh says are more like a traditional drill sheet. They're there to pull ideas out of the lesson that are more calculation based. Then on the inside back cover, we have different ideas for you regarding connections with history, other CC strands, or games you can play on the go. And then on the back cover, there's a game that your family could play together just to enjoy math and practice in a more in a less practiced way and more fun way. So those are the frames, right? Those pieces that, just like any picture frame, enhances the picture that's inside it. The frames of the curriculum of the lesson booklet are designed to enhance what those lesson pages give you. So does that help?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Donna, for younger families, yes, we are going to continue to offer manipulatives, and in the companion, how families may use those manipulatives at home if they choose. Are there any? I just noticed that one question that I don't think we'd answered. Any other questions that haven't been answered yet before we move on?
So Carrie's asking about being a tutor and that, yes, you would go over something similar to those first 4 pages to set the child up to go home with their parent and do the work.
I had a question kind of related to the frames, the charts, and the lesson pages. I noticed on the lesson pages, they all have these little headings on the top, like words, symbols, and images, or range, or sets. Does that kind of tell me where on the chart to go to or which frame to go to? Does that make sense? Like, as we're working through the worksheets, is that like a thing that will tell me which part of the chart this information came from?
Not necessarily. It is not the title of the page of the whole page will relate to the chart that it roughly matches up to. The frames, again, are broader in scope in some ways because they're going across many weeks. So they're a little bit separate. The lesson page bars, however, will be the same for all domains. So it may not necessarily correlate back to the chart, but it will if you have 3 students and they're all working on page 4. Say I'm stuck on symbols and images, you'll know exactly what part of the page that they're on.
Sure. So if I go way up to the darker bar where it says properties of inequalities, that tells me something about which chart. That, okay, thank you.
Yes.
I know it's probably been answered, but part of me was like, I'm just trying to see that. Thank you.
Okay. All right, anything
Keep
else?
going. Kirsty, if you want to keep going, I'll look at the questions and type them in.
Okay. Excellent. All right, so lesson 4, we notice here it's addition and subtraction. We are moving into operations now. And so where maybe a lot of math curricula that you've seen jump right into operations, the math map stops and talks about numbers first, right? And then the order of numbers. And now we're finally getting to operating on numbers. So as we look at this, what is familiar and what is unfamiliar to you?
Addition and subtraction with the number lines familiar. But then doing it with the imaginary is new or different.
I love the sorry. I love the dominoes. I love playing that game, so that's familiar at the end, at the bottom.
I really like how the imaginary number line was introduced in booklet 3, so that they've already learned how to compare larger and smaller numbers on the imaginary number line before we start adding them in booklet 4.
So I thought that this would be a good page just to talk a little bit, use some of those classical skills of learning. And so I'm going to ask you to do some things, and you're welcome to share what you're seeing or yourself. But we're going to look, let me see if I can get the laser pointer here. Look up in this top left box, the word symbols and images box. And I would like you to attend to the matching line. And what I mean by that is this line here, that is it, they can trace that first matching line. Okay. So what is being matched? Right? When we attend to that, what's being matched?
The vocabulary to the number.
Excellent, Babs. The vocabulary to the number. So as we look at that, do we see two different equations? And could we name the parts of the equations? Right. So we could say, I could read the maybe where a parent's going to help me read addend plus addend equals sum. And the student might be able to read the other parts, 1 + 2 = 3. Right? And so I notice that these words and symbols are being matched, and then I can read them, I can name them. Now, if I took that to the next step and I compare the words to the symbols, right, the matching is going to help me do that comparison. So I could add and addend in 2 and sum in 3. Right. And I would not necessarily expect a 6-year-old to be doing this, right? But this is how even using the naturals lesson pages, right, we can be being dialectic. And so does anybody want to take a stab at how you would define addend or sum?
Seems that the addend is the first number in the equation.
But since it also is for the second number there, then maybe the parts of the addition problem, the pieces, and then the total altogether is the sum.
Excellent. Way to work together, ladies. Right. So we look at that and we go, well, it looks like the things I'm adding are my addends and what I get is my sum, right? So we don't have to be formally defining it, right? But we think this is what we're doing. And so without looking it up in the glossary, without somebody telling you, without somebody coming alongside and being didactic and saying, this is the definition, right? We can use these skills of learning to define for ourselves what these words mean. And so that's our goal, right? Is to help our students build their knowledge and not just have it spoon-fed to them. All right, let's look at page 2 for lesson 4 and go ahead and identify some things that are familiar and some things that are unfamiliar.
Well, that summation symbol was unfamiliar to me over and over and over again. I would get it and then it would be unfamiliar again. It was one of those things I had to return to a lot. So sometimes even something that you've seen before can remain unfamiliar a while.
Or Jill, it can become familiar and we still don't have a good understanding, right? So grammar can be familiar to us even when we don't really know what it means.
That's very true and very encouraging.
And while it still looked unfamiliar, I knew I saw it someplace else. I knew it was introduced I wasn't sure how far back, but it does appear in booklet 3. So I could have a sigh of relief that yes, it's familiar.
Right, but we're still in the grammar stage with it. We haven't gotten I haven't gotten dialectic with it. It's really.
I think about it, it's kind of like going to church every Sunday, right? And you see all those people. And so you recognize the faces, but unless you spend time with each one of them, right, they're familiar, but I don't know them yet, right? And so as I get to know people, as I participate in book clubs and book Bible studies and go to fellowship dinners, now I start putting names together with the people. And then as I have conversations, I start to get to know them. But it may be that their face is just familiar for a while. I know that. And then sometimes when I see things out of context, right, you bump into somebody at the grocery store and you go, I know you from somewhere, but I don't remember where, right? So yes, Jill, right, we have to be patient with ourselves. That familiarity is just that first step to developing that understanding. So some things on this page, right, that I think it was Anne mentioned, right? I'm familiar with the images from like the and the block bars and the blocks, right? The 100 blocks and so forth. And so we're using those concrete examples to help understand abstract ideas. And so we're going to see that, especially here with the naturals, where we're going to have a lot more concrete examples for students. But that's something that all of our students can benefit from, sometimes coming back and saying, hey, what example can I use here? And especially understand, right? When I start to understand what 4 is, that concrete idea of being able to know what 4 is going to help me to understand, well, what's 4/3, right? How can that help me? And that's the idea of domains, right? That I can use things that I'm familiar with to understand the things that are less familiar. And then notice, again, just touching back on what Leigh said about parents reading to their students, right? That reading is really the first job of a mathematician. Right? If mathematicians can't read what they're doing, then they really can't do the math. So we have to be able to read before we can do anything else with it. And so that's why understanding the language of mathematics is so, so important. All right, let's look at page 3. And let's take a look at this page. What's familiar and unfamiliar here?
The
temperatures.
pictures.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go. That's fine.
The temperatures like boiling point and freezing point are definitely familiar.
I think that the idea of pattern and sequence, and that they could be different, that we might use those words interchangeably. So having them listed separately and having some more information could be unfamiliar.
I feel like the pictures really help the kids connect those numbers to what they've experienced.
I didn't have to look up the circle notation to know that was degrees. That was something that was instantly familiar.
So here's a question: is what's familiar for one person always going to be what's familiar to else?
Not a bit.
Right, we're all going to have a different familiar and unfamiliar, and so we need to be ourselves when things feel really unfamiliar. Right, and so I think that's one thing that we want to encourage everybody is like, everybody's going to see this in a different way, but we also need to be patient with our students, because there are going to be a lot of things as parents that we're going to be familiar with, and that our students may not be. And so being able to be patient with them while they're building their grammar, before we want to help them understand all of it. Right. So it's tempting sometimes to want to be able to jump in and say, oh, well, let me explain that to you. Pulling back and saying, no, it's really important that you be able to read this, that you discover the patterns, that you are building that grammar before we jump into trying to understand it.
Something I'd like to point out is, okay, so I say I have a kindergartner doing this, or first grader, someone that's 5, 6, or 7, and they take the pattern word and they make it match everything on the right. I would say, well done. You followed the instructions. You were supposed to match things, and that might be enough. And then in the car later that day, I might go, hey, let's do some patterns that are in sequence together. And let's do some patterns that maybe we don't know the sequence of together. right? That getting it right is not the goal. It's reading it and thinking about how to improve the reading ability is the goal.
I really like the very bottom, the substitute with the triangle and circle, and that for a non-reader or for someone who struggles with reading, it's so cool because it's like just figuring out this secret pattern and solving it. To me, that addresses children that may not be strong in reading or recognizing these words, that you could enter into this, you could participate in this sheet, this piece of work, and not feel intimidated by it because it's you've shrunk the amount of verbal words and directions to familiar, so that's so hospitable to kids that struggle. So that's great.
Because, and then some people were asking about calculus. This should begin to offer you assurance. There's not very many for little children's programs that have you start to read functions.
Yes, there were so many things, having been in the pilot with one of my kids while they were in Challenge A, there were so many things that were brand new to us that I see in the naturals, that I know it's going to be shown to them, that those all, like the real number line. Until Math Map, I never labeled the number line the real number line. I never thought about what domain I was in. I didn't think of everything as a function before. And so lots of shift in the 7th grade that they'll be seeing from kindergarten and becoming familiar with, which is really brilliant.
I remember Leigh saying one time that this curriculum was really written for like the B and C student, as opposed to the child who just gets it automatically. But I love that it brings the B and C, if we can call them, that's not really, I know I shouldn't be using those terms, but you know what I mean. It brings them into the conversation because it equips them with the language of math that they don't have. And it also brings this student up here that gets it automatically. It gives them the ability to converse with their peers about these things. It like I remember my friend Janet Waldrop, she often says, it's hard for me to teach math sometimes because I just get it. I don't necessarily know how to explain it. But so for each of those individuals, it gives them all a common language so that you can have the conversation, which is so exciting.
That's beautiful, Jana. And I think what you just touched on there is that idea that there are students who just get it, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're rhetorical, right? If they can't then turn around and talk to somebody else about it. But in our traditional modern education, what happens to that student is, oh, you're a really good student. We're just going to keep pushing you along. And we never stop and say to them, what do you really understand? And so a lot of those students actually end up in places where I'm suddenly stuck because nobody said to them, okay, what's the language of mathematics? Or what patterns are you noticing, right? What are you, right? Instead of just following an algorithm and being able to do that, this is going to help them take that sort of instant understanding. But now we're going to be using all of those skills of learning, including those rhetorical skills, right? For them to be able to in turn communicate that understanding to other people. So I love that, Jana, how you said it's going to bring all of those students together and unite them. Because that's what we're about, right? Is unity in the body, and mathematics is an important part of that. So,
and just to have making that comment that I understand it, but I can't teach it should make someone sad, especially if they're an adult. And one day I had a student in Mandala, I won't say his name, but he'll tell you who he is. And he just thought it was nonsense to have to understand the words and to explain the steps to me. And I said to him, you're going to be such a horrible father. And he said to me, what? And I said, you're going to have children that need things explained to them. And just because you know it, you can't be arrogant. You got to break it down. He became my best math student the next day. The Lord told me what to say to him, right? So we need to help the body of Christ, not ourselves. But we help the body of Christ by helping ourselves.
So then you get both if you go after what the Lord's mission is versus just your own enlightenment. And then you don't have knowledge that puffs up, you have knowledge that builds up.
And I'm going to switch us to the next slide, but I will just mention that that somebody who is working with our team, the Math Map team, and thus has access to the charts, has been helping her son with calculus in college and has found the charts to be helpful. And so yes, we are equipping students to study all of mathematics, including calculus. But calculus, and I'll just say this, right? Calculus is not our end goal, right? Knowing the Lord is our end goal, and calculus is just one tool that we can use for that. All right, and on to our last page. I'm going to ask you to look at this as you're looking for what's familiar and what's unfamiliar. I want you to think about what it means for things to be like terms, right? When we combine like terms or compare terms, we're always looking for things that are alike. And so as you look at what's familiar and what's unfamiliar, right, how does this help us to tell our children what we're talking about when we say you can only combine things that are alike?
I really do appreciate the symbols that you're using that are not functions, but like the candies, the pieces of candy or the cats. I've seen that on some of the other pages also that make it easy for them to comprehend similar parts or matching things.
Yeah, this is again more for the parent. We're hoping that you'll go, oh, if 8 candies and 3 candies are 11 candies, maybe these 2 swiggles plus 4 swiggles are 6 swiggles. Right. And now reading integrals aren't so hard.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I was just gonna say, you can have some really fun conversations though about, what happens if you combine 6 cats and are those birds or flowers?
Birds.
And 2 birds, right? What happens if I combine 8 bats and 4 snakes?
They eat one another?
That's what I was wondering.
Becomes a subtraction problem.
So I downloaded my naturals page a while ago, and mine actually has 10 frames and it looks really different. So I'm assuming that this must have updated since I printed it a long time ago. Does that make sense?
Yes, Deanna, we updated it earlier this fall. So you probably did it right before, if you did it last summer. Okay.
I was just going to point out, Leigh, the one thing I wanted to point out to you as you're thinking about, right, units and what's alike and what's not alike. Notice at the bottom where we have the 20 plus 5 equals 25. And what is the unit that we're adding there?
You're adding ones.
Excellent, Kathy. We're adding ones, but we hide that, don't we? Don't we oftentimes hide that from students? And so, especially when we get to fractions, now all of a sudden, when we think of 3.5 plus 4.25, well, if I thought of that in terms of what are my units, and I say, oh, I have 3 halves and 4 quarters, now I go, oh, they're not the same thing. I can't add halves and quarters without making them somehow alike, right? So I could go from, I had 8 pieces of taffy and 3 peppermints, or I could say I have 8 pieces of candy and 3 pieces of candy, right? I changed what they were. And so I can do that the same with fractions. And so that's one of the things that we really are hoping we're going to help people to recognize is these hidden things, especially when we're starting to talk about things in algebra, right? And we have hidden zeros and ones all over the place. And so that's going to be one thing that people are going to see. All right, so I'm going to just remind you, if you're looking at this at home, comparing in sets 1, 5, 9, and 13, then 2, 6, 10, and 14, 3, 7, 11, and 15, 4, 8, 12, and 16. And what we've done today will help you with those other pages. And then what questions are still to be asked and answered?
Somebody asked a basic question again about the frames. So what's going on is some of you have only access to the part that's available to everyone on CC Connected. And then some of you are leaders and you've actually got the whole curriculum in your hand. And so please keep asking questions about the frames, but just recognize a lot of people have no idea what you're talking about. So Kirsty explained them fairly well. I'm not going to do that again. You can go back and listen to this. But in general, what the frames are is other things you can do besides workbook pages that are math related. And that's what everybody that has the curriculum is seeing.
Are the charts anything like what the charts look like in the scribblers at home for the math section? Or is it something similar?
Some of it is similar. They did take some of what we have. There are 4 pages of charts. I'm gonna they look like this. They have a blue bar at the top, and if you've looked at the domain map at the top of the math map, that domain bar, you'll notice that that blue matches the transcendentals color, and so that is your visual cue that this page is not right. It's not gold. It's not like the rest of the complex lessons. This is the goal for transcendental students to be familiar with these charts by the time they're done. And so they're the same every year. So your kindergarten parent may use these to see where does this naturals exercise fit into this big picture. Or my older student might use these as a reference. Right, but they're the same every year. So over time, we're going to build familiarity with the charts. And as I said, there's 4 per week, so there's 120 charts pages total. And if you think of the math map as being the scope and sequence, those domains, those 30 topics, give you sort of the brief scope. When you look at the charts, that's like your complete scope. Here's all of the ideas that we're going to be exploring through the math map.
And for those charts, I'm kind of drawing parallels with the Essentials program when we have those charts for language. It is beneficial for our kids to chant and recite the charts, and so that they actually are useful. Are there any plans for CC to actually, come up with plans for kids to memorize those charts? Is it even humanly possible?
Yeah, you know what, that's built into the program as the children go on past the challenge A and B. And that's one of the other reasons why there's that invention and memoria pages in the frames. Those are very reduced forms of the chart, and they are very easy to memorize if you'll just work. It's just easy. They can become memorized because they take a topic and unify it. So for instance, if you're a parent who's trying to figure out how vectors work in one dimension, well, you have to go through all the lessons in the charts to figure out how they work in all the other dimensions. Well, one of the pages in the frames says, you know what, let's just look at how vectors work everywhere and anywhere, and it's all on one page. Right, so the frames have other tools to help you begin to memorize the charts.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Whoop, you're muted, hon.
There. The pamphlet that you just held up, that is one of the 30 pamphlets, right? And that's 1 week?
1 week, yes.
And that includes 4 pages per day of 4 days at home and the 4 pages that we go through in community. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, plus a little bit more, plus some games and activities and things.
Okay, so we will get, with the curriculum, we'll get 30 of those.
Yes.
Okay, just a very different approach. Okay, I think I understand. Thank you.
You know, we did that so that children who are overwhelmed with math, part of the reason they get overwhelmed is we hand them this big book And we wanted young children who aren't that math lovers to be able to say, that's all I got to do is those pages in the middle there, Mom. All right, so.
So I also have a question, and maybe I missed this, so you can tell me if it's was in an earlier book club meeting, but is it gonna be like in our community days? Because you know, this is, I mean, so obviously for challenge community days, this will be used, but are these gonna be introduced or used in a foundations community day as well somehow, like part of new grammar's math component, or added in somewhere, or it's just kind of separately used at home for the other days of the week? Because I know you said something about tutors equipping parents, and I'm thinking a director versus a tutor, you know what I mean?
So at this point, I don't know if Leigh wants to answer this, but at this point, we are not changing the memory work for foundations. That will remain, the foundations memory work will remain the same that it is, and this would be the curriculum you're doing at home. We are piloting some ways to just gently introduce some of the conversation to the essentials classroom, but it's not going to replace the current emphasis on math games and working on that mental mathematics and essentials. And then in challenge, they will be diving in deep in conversation centered around the math booklets. But the beautiful thing is, if you can imagine, all of those challenge directors and or tutors and those foundations tutors and essentials tutors, and then all of your community mamas and dads, you can all be doing the same booklet, right? So this week we were talking about addition. So imagine if everybody's working on addition at home and you've all looked at the picture, which I'll hold up real quick for you. Sorry, the booklet I had out was one we were looking at this week. So I just thought I will pull this out for you. And so this week we have all been working on this booklet, and here's the picture. And so you go to community now, and the mom next to you goes, oh, hey, what did you do with addition? You know, did you see the pattern? Did you get this? And you can say, oh, I used that picture on the cover to show my child, right? Here's the pattern that we were hopping from lily pad to lily pad. And so now my community, whether it's actually a part of what they're doing on community day, can be having one central conversation about the same math topic, about that same piece of art. Right, so it can unify you at your family at home, but it can also unify your community because we're all talking about the same thing. So, and Leigh is working hard on all of the strands to bring unity for our families at home. But I think this is going to be the first strand where you're really going to see that foundations and challenge families are all going to be talking about the same thing every week and bringing that unity to community. Right? Since that's what community is, right? Is with unity. So.
All right, well, we're out of time, so encourage people to come back next week and ask some more questions. Thank you, everybody, for attending. It was a really joyful hour for me. Thank you, Kirsty, for leading.
Appreciate you, ladies.
We appreciate all of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for all your hard work, ladies.
So exciting.
See you next week.
It's beautiful.